Well, as I told you last week, we are going to be, I gave a lecture last Tuesday, I guess, a week ago today, and on modern times, the 20s. And today I will be talking about the Great Depression and the New Deal. And then I will begin this Thursday a series of 3 lectures on World War II. Actually, can you hear lectures me? On the end of the 20s, the beginning of the Depression, the war at home, so to speak, Pearl Harbor, all the way up through the end. And that's a series of 3 lectures. And then you will have an examination. So you have 5 lectures that will be covered in your next exam, which I believe is on, let's see here, your next exam will be on March 25th, and you will have a review session on March 23rd. So that's kind of where we are with the class. With that, here we go. It's always difficult for me to give this lecture. I say always. It's mostly because since COVID, because what your generation have experienced with COVID and the economic downturn, which has not been identified as a depression, but more of a recession. And those terms can be used interchangeably up to certain degrees. But it's always difficult to talk about what happened 90 years ago when you have experienced yourselves what's happening in your lifetimes as being a very terrible economic time for many people. So I want you to keep in perspective that what I'm going to be talking about today really is worse than what you have seen in almost exactly 1 year ago is when we started the COVID-19 recession. And using these terms, I'm not going to identify them as economic terms that are really exacting, but we can generally say that a recession is not as bad as a depression, but both of them involve loss of economic activity for certain segments of the population. It's always worse for those at the bottom end of the socioeconomic class. It's always worse for people in minority groups. It was then and has been now worse for women than for men. And these are very generalized statements, I understand. But at the same time, I want you to appreciate what it was like back in the Depression of the 30s, because it sets up sort of the rest of the course that we'll be dealing with. Okay, so let's start with a picture here of the new president of the United States, Herbert Hoover. I told you in the last class that Herbert Hoover had been elected president over a guy by the name of Al Smith because of Al Smith's Catholicism. Herbert Hoover was considered to be a pretty good businessman. He had been Secretary of Commerce, so he had a business background. But most historians today will argue that Herbert Hoover did not cause the Depression. He tried to get us out of the Depression. He failed at that. Most people will give credit to the next president, Franklin Roosevelt, for having gotten us out of the Depression. I do not agree with that, and I'll tell you about that today, why. The only thing that recovered the United States from the Great Depression was World War II. All of the things I'll talk about today that were an attempt to get us out of the Depression are not that. They are things that made people's lives better during the Depression, but they did not solve the Depression. The World War II solved the Depression, at least in the United States. So let's talk about what this Depression was. First of all, it starts in 1929 with the great stock market crash. It actually takes place in the early fall of 1929, after Herbert Hoover had been elected president and been inaugurated in March. That's back when we used to inaugurate our presidents March 4th instead of January 20th like we do today. The great stock market crash was a crash of 13% in one day. 13% in one day. And by the time the Depression really gets going, 3 years after the great stock market crash, the market dropped 90% in 3 years. Now think about that. If you had your life savings tied up in stock, and 3 years later, 90% of it is gone, then you can see that for you, the Depression hit really hard. So let me talk a little bit about why was there a depression? What the hell happened? Well, first of all, as I told you in last week's lecture, credit became very easy to get. By that, I mean people were buying cars that didn't have enough money to make the payment. People were buying houses with mortgages that they couldn't sustain. Certainly, they couldn't sustain it when they lost their job. But in some cases, they couldn't even sustain it with their jobs. In other words, banks were lending money to buy more house than these people could afford. So we can argue that one of the causes of the Great Depression is that credit had become too easy. Banks were lending money to people that they should not have lent money to in terms of their ability to make a payment. A second reason for the Depression was that we believed that it was because of overproduction, making too many things, both agricultural products, manufactured products. Both of those were issues that caused it. But we can also argue that it wasn't just a matter of overproduction, but it was underconsumption. Those two things go together. They are both a problem when an economy is in collapse, as it was in the United States. Now, let me also say that today what I am talking about is the Depression in the United States. However, the world was in a depression, and the United States was one of the last countries to really have the Depression hit here at home. So we've got credit as an issue. We've got overproduction and underconsumption. We've also got, I think we can argue, speculation in the stock market. There was no regulation by the Securities and Exchange Commission. So people were buying stocks that didn't have the money to pay for those stocks, buying it on credit, so to speak, and speculating meaning that they bought the stock not because they thought it was a good company that was making good products and that the value of their stock would go up, up, and up, but they bought it in speculating. They didn't know anything about that company. They just knew that they had been told by somebody that the value would go up. And of course, when the value goes down, that means that they are losing the value for the stock that they purchased. So we can argue that it was also about speculation in the stock market. We can also argue that one of the reasons was the Federal Reserve System, which had only been around for about 25 years. The Federal Reserve System did not know how to handle the failure of banks. The banking system collapses. And one of the remedies for the banking system will be what I will talk about today. So that's kind of what happened that causes this Great Depression. And Herbert Hoover, as President of the United States, did not know how to handle it. And the reason was there were no simple answers. There were no simple answers to solving this problem, this economic downturn. Unemployment raising to numbers in the 20 to 30%. And in some areas of the world, some areas, the urban areas, it was even worse than that. So let me just first show you some pictures that are taken of this period of time, the Great Depression. Here you see people, I believe this picture is taken in Oklahoma, where the great dust storms of the 1930s happened to take place. Here is a line of a soup kitchen line, people standing in line to get food because they couldn't afford it. And it's either that or let your families go hungry. And I love this billboard sign, world's highest standard of living. There's no way like the American way. And here we are with all of these people standing in line to get food. It was a terrible time. Now, as I just said, when I talk about this, I realize that your generation has seen food lines in Dallas, Texas, because of COVID-19 and because of unemployment and because of businesses collapsing. I recognize that. So for your generation, you have seen something that is not as bad as this period of time, that is still bad for any one individual that would have to stand in line at a soup kitchen to be able to feed their family or to feed themselves. It's terrible. So just putting that in historical perspective. So let's talk about what the United States does to try to solve this problem. That is, we elect a new president of the United States in 1932, who will take office in 1933. His name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He was a cousin of the man that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Teddy Roosevelt. He was from New York. He was wealthy. He was the product of a rich family. He went to law school at Columbia University. He did not graduate from Columbia University Law School. In other words, he didn't get his law degree. However, in the state of New York, in those days, even if you didn't have a law degree, you could sit for the bar. And he did sit for the bar and passed it. So he was legally a lawyer. He married his cousin. Now, it wasn't a first cousin situation, but he did marry his cousin. Her name was Eleanor Roosevelt. So Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin Roosevelt got married, and obviously Eleanor Roosevelt didn't have to change her name because she was already a Roosevelt. So let me show you some pictures of him. This is his campaign button. We need you. And many people voted for Franklin Roosevelt as what we call the acronym ABH, anybody but Hoover. Probably could have been elected president. And here, let me show you another picture of him. Excuse me just a minute here. Get through my slides. That's that picture. Then here he is working behind his desk. This is the image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that most people saw on the news. But here is the real Franklin Roosevelt. Yes, confined to a wheelchair. He had polio. And no one knew this. The American people did not know about his polio until almost after he had died. He was a New York State senator before he became the governor of New York. He was an assistant secretary of the Navy. That was his job for a while. Some historians make the argument that he was a second-rate intellect, but a first-rate temperament, had a first-rate temperament. When historians are asked to name the greatest presidents, and we go through this about every 10 years, they poll those of us that are professional historians to see who we believe are the greatest. Generally speaking, Abraham Lincoln comes out first. George Washington comes out second. And generally speaking, Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes out third as the greatest of the 46 presidents America has had. I argue that his greatness is more about his having been commander-in-chief of the United States Armed Forces during World War II than it being about anything he does during the Great Depression to solve the Depression. But he was in charge now. And when he gives his inaugural speech in 1933, he will utter the famous words, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." I'll repeat that. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. That is from FDR's inaugural address given in 1933. Roosevelt's temperament was that he didn't mind being and going against the grain. In other words, if everybody thought this was a good idea, he decided that it wasn't, and he went in a different direction. He didn't worry necessarily about popular opinion about himself because he came into office with a great majority of the American people voting for him. So he felt like he had the support of the American people, even though he didn't necessarily have the support of his own party, politicians, and certainly not Republicans. Now, he is a Democrat, okay? He is a Democrat. He also believed strongly in the role of government in solving people's problems. He wasn't like I guess he was a little bit like the progressive we talked about before, but even went further than that. He would not be called today a conservative. He would not be called someone who believes in small government. he wouldn't, for example, believe in some of the things that Ronald Reagan said in his inaugural address. I believe that government is not the solution. I believe that government is the problem. That would not be something that Franklin Roosevelt believed in, certainly when he came into office. However, he will struggle with finding resolution. He will struggle with finding resolution for America's problems because there weren't very many good solutions. We did not have a government that was designed to solve the kind of big economic problems that the American people had at this time. So he decided that the way to at least make people feel better about themselves is to talk to the American people. We had this new medium called radio. So here he is with what he called the fireside chats, where he would come on to people's airwaves at night and talk about what the Americans, what we are trying to do to solve the problems. In his fireside chats, he wanted to do two major, well, not two major things. There were two big goals, but I think we can probably call them four goals to solve the problems of the American people. Number one was to restore confidence in the American government. He decided that big issues had to be resolved in the first 100 days, the first 100 days of his presidency. Now, if you've been following the news at all lately, you've seen President Biden talking about the first 100 days, solving problems in the first 100 days. And that sort of started with FDR. That the 100-day measurement, that's a little over 3 months. You need to get people feeling better about their own lives in the first 100 days, or it'll be hard to hold them in support of your efforts if you can't do it in the first 100 days. So the first thing that he had to do was to get people's confidence back in the government's ability to do things. And one of those things was solving what we called the banking crisis. The banks went out of business. Banks went belly up. And when they went belly up with your money in your account. So essentially, he closed the banks. We had a banking holiday for a few days, and I think in some places even into weeks. Now remember, back in those days, you had federal banks and you had state chartered banks. If your money was in a federal bank, that's fine, but it wasn't guaranteed. Even some of those federally chartered banks went out of business with your money. So he created an organization called the FDIC. The FDIC. That stands for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. FDIC. It's still in existence today. What the government did was to guarantee that if you had money in a bank and that bank went belly up, went bankrupt, the federal government would guarantee your money up to an amount of $2,500. So if you had more than $2,500, they would tell you that you should put it in more than one bank, because if that bank goes under, we'll only guarantee your account up to $2,500. So if you have $10,000, you better put your $2,500 into 4 banks, because we're going to guarantee it up to $2,500 per institution. Now that organization still exists today. It is a government organization, the FDIC. But today, the amount is guaranteed up to $250,000. So for those of you that have more than $250,000, I strongly recommend you to put it in more than one bank. So for those of you that have $1 million, I suggest you put 250,000 in 4 different banks rather than in one big bank, just in case your bank goes bankrupt. FDIC, I consider it to be one of the most important government institutions ever created. And then I'm going to start throwing out what I call acronyms, economic acronyms. These are going to be organizations that are created, government institutions that will be created to help people live their lives. Oh, they'll argue that it's to solve the depression, but it's not. That's not going to happen. What's going to happen instead is that the government will try to keep people alive, keep people's hunger satisfied to a certain extent. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This provided jobs for over 2 million men. Some of these jobs were literally digging a hole and then having another person come along behind you and covering up that hole. Yes, nothing produced. Now, that's an extreme example. Some of the CCC did more meaningful things. They chopped trees. They helped build some of the national parks. And the money that you made doing this work was sent automatically home to your family so that they had the money to live. Whereas you didn't need much money because you were put up into some government housing. You were given government clothing. You actually were provided with meals. So your needs weren't very great. Sort of like being in the military and that everything was provided for you. And since you didn't need that money was shipped home to your family. The CCC is successful in keeping men employed, but it was men only. An additional organization was called the PWA, the Public Works Administration. Here is a picture of a bridge. I'm not quite sure where this bridge is, but they built a lot of bridges. These bridges were put up lots of different places. In fact, some bridges that you will find that are still up when you drive. I know there's one over in Clovis, in Fort Sumner, New Mexico. When you drive on Highway 84 and you make a right-hand turn, you go up under a bridge that was built as part of the PWA, and there's a plaque there that identifies it as having been constructed for that purpose. Now let me talk about something that is hard for me to lecture on because it's just one of those things that's hard to understand. Some of you are in agricultural economics. I know that's going to be your major. We have a very good agricultural economics department here at Texas Tech. Truth of the matter is, agricultural economics is difficult to understand because in the early 1930s, 33, 34, 35, and during this depression, so many Americans were out of work, and so many Americans did not have food, that the United States decided to restrict production. How did we restrict production? Well, we paid farmers not to grow crops. We paid farmers to say, this acreage, we don't want you to put anything on it, and we'll give you a subsidy. We'll give you government money to keep you from planting corn. Because if you plant corn and all these other people are planting corn, we're going to have an oversupply of corn, and therefore the corn market will go down, prices will go down. I have a picture up here of three little pigs. These three little pigs are on their way to being slaughtered. We slaughtered over 1 million baby pigs because the pork prices would have collapsed. Now you can make an argument, and I'm sure many of you are thinking of this, but why don't you just slaughter those baby pigs and send the food? Or why don't you let them grow for 6 months and grow up into bigger pigs, and we'll slaughter those pigs and we'll have the food and it'll be in the soup kitchens and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, makes all the sense in the world. But the truth of the matter is we took out of production over 230 million acres. Took out of production 230 million acres so that we could keep crop prices high enough to where we could support farmers. But at the same time, those farmers that we took their acreage out of production, when we took the acreage out of production, those people still got money from the government to keep them from growing crops. Yeah, I know it's difficult to understand all of the thinking that went into all of these decisions back in the 1930s. One of the most successful projects of the Depression, and incidentally, all of these things that I'm talking about now, we generally call part of what we call the New Deal. The New Deal. It's the same name as that little town not too far from here, New Deal, Texas. The New Deal was these, I'm giving you just a few of the things that Roosevelt did to try to get us out of the Depression, the TVA being one of them. The TVA was important for Appalachia areas. It provided several different benefits: flood control, electric generation, and what we're doing is damming up rivers in order to create electricity, manufacture of fertilizer products. It was something that was created in order to create jobs in some cases, but mostly to provide electricity to poor families living in Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, even down further south than that. The idea being that the government is going to take a major role in producing a product that everyone needs, a utility of sorts. The TVA is still around today. It's still a government institution. And it's part of what we think of as a successful project created under Franklin Roosevelt during the New Deal. And then what is generally considered to be the most successful project of the New Deal, and is still with us today, the Social Security Act of 1936. President Roosevelt decided that part of our problem in America was that we had people that were old, not being able to live successfully, not being able to put food on the table. And so they created an organization in the government that would take America's workers' money and invest it and give it back to those people when they turned 65 years old. So you start a job when you're, well, let's say 25. Let's just use these numbers. You start a job, you come out of college, take your job, and you're making a certain amount of money, and we're going to take 5% of it. And we're going to invest it. And we're going to take it out of your paycheck for the rest of your working life, which at that time was supposed to be 40 years. So we're going to take your money when you're 25, and for 40 years, we'll take it out and we'll invest it in government securities. Different decisions will be made over the next 40 years, but we'll invest it. And then when you turn 65, we will give it back to you for the rest of your life. Now that worked fine when people retired at 65 and died when they were 68. Yeah, that's about what it was. We'll take your money and we'll give it back to you for the 3 years that you're going to live after you get done working. Plenty of money. Your money plus the investment that we put into it will give us enough money to pay you until you are 68. Well, of course, you can do the math on this and realize that people stopped dying at 68 and started living until they were 78. So now we don't have 3 years to pay you. We have 13 years to pay you. And then, of course, it changed from 78 to about 80, 81. Women were living to 82, 83. All of a sudden, it then became a matter of taking the money away from those who were 25 and giving that money to those who were 65. In other words, it wasn't their money anymore. It was your money. And I can talk about that now. I still pay Social Security. Excuse me. I still pay Social Security because I'm still working, but I'm obviously a little bit older than 65. So your money, all of you that are working, and my money that I'm being taken out still, we're all giving that money to people who are over the age of 65. And we even changed it again. We even said, hey, I'll tell you what, you can retire early. You don't have to retire at 65, you can retire at 62. And if you retire at 62, you'll get less money because you're going to live longer. You're going to need that money for a longer period of time. So the math just doesn't work. And every few years, somebody talks about, you know what we need to do. And this was the way it was back in 07 and 08, during the later years of the George Bush administration. They started talking about privatizing Social Security. They started saying, well, you know, if you're 25 years old, rather than us taking that 5.8% or whatever it was, taking that money out and investing it, having the government invest it, we'll let you invest it on your own. You take your money out and you won't have to pay Social Security, and eventually we won't pay you. You will be responsible for your own situation when you get to be 65 years old. Well, of course, at about the time that happened, we went into an incredible recession and the stock market dropped about 30% over a period, about 25%, I think, over a period of about a year and a half. And everybody said, well, that was a dumb idea. I'm glad we didn't do that because now our Social Security accounts would be a lot less than they would be otherwise. So Social Security is always a controversial thing. And everybody that runs for president always says we won't touch Social Security because it's in a lockbox and it's going to be protected for those of us, because it is our money. After all, we did They did take it away from us to give it back to us at some point. Problem is we're outliving what was taken out. That's the issue. And it's going to be an issue for all of you for the rest of your lives, for the rest of your working lives. This will be a problem. But it is considered to be the most important legislative act of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt presidency, and it's still with us today. And with that, I'm going to do a stop share, and I will answer any questions that any of you may have about this lecture.
Hey, Professor, what was the two goals of the fireside chat? I got kind of confused there.
Okay. Well, there's actually several goals, but I sort of want you to concentrate on two. The first one is restoring confidence in the American government's ability to solve America's problems. That's the first thing, confidence level. And he wanted to get it done. He said his goal is getting it all done in 100 days. Of course, that doesn't happen, but that was his goal. Make people feel good about their American government's ability to solve their problems. And then the second thing was to solve the banking problem. And they did that with the FDIC. That was one of the first legislative actions. That actually takes place. I believe the FDIC was actually created in the summer of 33, and he takes office in March of 33. So it happened in the first 100 days, pretty close to it.
Well, thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Yes.
I got a question.
Yes, Claire.
What did the FDIC stand for again?
Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. FDIC. It's part of the government, but it's really kind of a separate institution because it will, it's insurance. It means that they've got to find the ability to be able to pay off banks that go under. They'll also start requiring it to be not just federally chartered banks, but state chartered banks. So those of you that have your money in things like Plainview and Plainview Bank, and there's a whole lot of banks around Lubbock here. Every time you turn around, it seems like there's a new bank, Happy Bank and all those things. Most of those are state chartered, but they fall under federal rules. It was a whole new way of looking at banking that the federal government has to get involved to make sure people have confidence in their bank, in their money being given to the bank.
Okay, thank you.
Professor?
Natalie.
Yes. So are we good on Hoovervilles, or are you going to talk about that any on the next lecture or anything?
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I show you a picture of Hooverville and I didn't talk about it? Yeah, okay, good point. Hooverville were people that had been evicted from their homes because they couldn't make their mortgage payments, having to move to the middle of big cities, and they actually lived in cardboard boxes. That picture that I had up there are cardboard boxes that people would live in. And they nicknamed them Hooverville because they blamed their situation on Hoover. It's a very pejorative term. It's not something you would be proud of to have it be called Hooverville, but that's what it was. It was people being evicted. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up. Anyone else?
I have one.
Yes, Aubrey.
Yes. Which states did you say were benefited from the TVA?
Well, it was designed to benefit Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. But some of that electric product actually moves its way down even into the northern parts of the Carolinas and Georgia. So but at the time it was designed for what they call Appalachia, and it was the damming up of rivers in those areas.
Okay.
Tennessee Valley Authority. And in fact, there's a big controversy about it. If you followed it in, I believe, I can't remember, it was the third or fourth, it was maybe the second or third year of the Trump administration. President Trump found out that the highest paid government worker was the chairman of the board of the TVA. He was making like millions of dollars, where nobody else makes millions of dollars working in the government, because it's a federal corporation, but it's a federal corporation under its own separate rules, because it was originally designed that way. Anyone else?
I was just going to say that
Kathy?
banks still have a rule about only being able to be closed for so many hours straight, and it goes back to the Depression where the banks crashed.
Yeah, exactly. And see, think about this time that there wasn't any regulation of state chartered banks, and there wasn't much regulation of federally chartered banks. I mean, you can go back to the days of Andrew Jackson and the second national bank crisis and stuff like that. But this is also, I don't want to get too heavily involved in this, but I know some of you may be economics majors and you know about Keynesian theory, market versus fiscal policy, monetary versus fiscal policy. There's a lot of things going on, but the best way to think of it is the government really didn't take an active role in monitoring the economic well-being of people. The progressives tried to do that with some of the things that they did regarding regulation. But then you get a president like Roosevelt who comes in and says, damn, people are out of work, people are unemployed. I don't remember this, I was too young, but my grandfather worked for a company called City Service. And it was an oil and gas company particularly in Oil Hill, Kansas, near Wichita. And I used to go visit him all the time in the summertime. But he would tell the stories about, that would have been 25 years earlier in the 1930s, where he was buying company stock through his payroll deduction. And he would get his paycheck, and the paycheck amount would be 0.00 because they took the money out to buy the company stock. But the stock that was originally $20 a share had dropped down to $1 a share. So he got 20 shares, but he got no money to buy his family food. And then, of course, the stock wasn't worth anything. Now, thank goodness he survived all that, and eventually his stock was worth something. But it was a really bad time. And the government wasn't really taking an active role in any of this until Roosevelt said, we got to solve these problems. But again, you'll understand this a little bit more when I talk about the World War II. But the truth of the matter is the Depression was never solved by anything that the United States government did. The Depression was solved by the United States going to war and becoming a creditor nation. Having said that, though, Roosevelt did a lot of good in keeping people alive and keeping people's families from going hungry. So we can't say that. And I'm not sure that it would have made any difference who the president would have been. It wouldn't make any difference, because the issues associated with solving that big a problem were beyond the government's control, with the government's ability to do the things that it could do then. Anyone else?
I have one more.
Aubrey.
Yeah, could you explain the banking holiday again?
The banking holiday was essentially, we closed all the banks for, depending on where it was, they closed them for days or weeks to keep people from pulling their money out. And then we put in the FDIC 3 months later, and then we guaranteed whatever you had in there would be there for you up to $2,500. That kept people from taking the money out of the bank and putting it under the mattress. And yeah, people did that. And so by doing that, the government still had, the bank could still survive with your assets in it. keep them from going bankrupt, keep them from going bankrupt, and then we could insure that money up to the 2,500. The government would make good up to that amount. Anything else? And each year, for a long time, the FDIC decided to guarantee the amounts by putting in an inflation factor. So just give some ideas, $2,500 in 1933 is the equivalent today of about 53,000, okay, looking at the inflation tables. And so 250,000 is not a reflection of 2,500 then is 250,000 now. No, it was a matter of attracting people's money into banks. Because those of you know that the reason that how banks make money is to take your money and give it to somebody else. And give it to somebody else at an interest rate that keeps the bank whole and gives the bank money to then lend to somebody else. That's how banking works. We didn't think of things like that back then. We thought of it we didn't think of the government's role being that way and that kind of monitoring of it. And it is now, thank goodness. Anyone else? Red, is that you or are you just scratching your shoulder? No problem.
I'm
Okay.
just scratching my shoulder.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Who else? Anyone? Well, okay. I'll tell you what. I'm going to let you go at almost 4:30. And Thursday's lecture is on the beginning of World War II. Very important for these next 3 lectures. They're pretty heavy lectures. So make sure you tune in. Same time, same place. I'll see you all on Thursday of this week.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Bye.